Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Specialty Crop Block Grant Program overview. My name is Brittany Grother, and I serve as the grants coordinator for the Division of Ag Marketing with the Kansas Department of Agriculture. The purpose of today's presentation is to just give a general overview of the Specialty Crop Block Grant Program. So if you're interested in applying for that grant, you have a better understanding of some of the requirements of the grant. We will have a separate presentation in 2 weeks to walk through the application process. So during that presentation, I'll go step by step through the different components of the application. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. If you have questions at any point in time, go ahead and drop those in the chat. And if not, you can come off of mute at the end to ask questions. We should have plenty of time. The purpose of the Specialty Crop Block Grant Program is to enhance the competitiveness of specialty crops in Kansas. So every state is eligible to receive this funding from the United States Department of Agriculture's Agricultural Marketing Service, but they have subawarded these funds out to the states because we understand the specific needs of our state's specialty crop industry. So in general, enhancing the competitiveness means leveraging efforts to market and promote specialty crops, assisting producers with research and development relevant to specialty crops grown here in Kansas, expanding the availability and access to specialty crops across the state, and then addressing our local, regional, and national challenges confronting our producers and then producers in the Midwest and across the United States. The USDA defines specialty crops as fruits, vegetables, tree nuts, dried fruits, horticulture crops, nursery crops, and that includes floriculture. So in general, to meet the USDA specialty crop definition, the plants must be cultivated or managed and used by people for food, medicinal purposes, or aesthetic gratification to be considered specialty crops. I wanted to take a minute to show you guys a website really quick that the USDA has. Over here. Okay. So the USDA um, has a website that defines what a specialty crop is under their standards. So if you ever have any questions of whether something falls under their definition of specialty crops, you can go to their website and they have tables that list every single crop they consider a specialty crop. So they've got your fruits and nuts and vegetables, culinary herbs, medicinal herbs, horticulture crops, bedding plants, flowers, perennials, cut flowers, all sorts of things. Got your Christmas trees, landscapings, and then at the very bottom, they have a list of ineligible commodities. So some that usually come up, any type of what you would consider a row crop in Kansas usually falls under ineligible under the specialty crop program. So cotton, sorghum, corn, wheat, those ones. Soybeans, hemp falls under an ineligible product type as well. I'm going to switch back over to our region. All right. That's in general what the USDA defines as a specialty crop. So you can always look more into it if you have a specific question about whether something's eligible or not. All right, funding priorities. So each year, the Kansas Department of Agriculture surveys the state's specialty crop growers to understand the needs of the industry and where to put importance on in terms of our funding decisions. So the top three results that came out of this year's survey were improving efficiency and reducing costs of distribution systems. So projects in that could include projects that seek to understand gaps in systems and supply and demand related issues related to specialty crops. The second one is sustainability, so projects with conservation or environmental outcomes. And then the third one is increasing nutrition, knowledge, and consumption of specialty crops. So those that could include projects that seek to understand child and adult nutrition knowledge and consumption of specialty crops, and developing materials to better educate specialty crop producers and buyers on things like food safety practices, or just in general projects to create awareness about specialty crops that are available to consumers in Kansas who may not know that those are grown here in the state. So this is different than what we've done in the years past in terms of the duration. Typically, the Kansas Department of Agriculture has put preference on projects that are 1 year in duration. But this year we've removed that limit. So projects can be up to 3 years in length per the USDA's grant period of performance. So projects must begin on September 30th, 2025. That would be the contractual start date of your project, and that is a standard date across the Specialty Crop Block Grant Program. And then projects must end no later than September 29th, 2028. You can end sooner than that, but you can have up to 3 years to complete your project. And we do ask that when you are figuring out the length of your project, you measure the length in quarters, just because that is our reporting standard. We report on quarters. So that makes it a little bit easier than instead of picking like a random date in April, you'd pick an end of a quarter. All right. So one thing to remember about the Specialty Crop Block Grant Program is that we fund projects. So you have to have a project in mind for this grant program. And the USDA defines a project as a set of interrelated tasks with a cohesive, distinct, specified, and defined goal. And they're different from your regular operations of your business or organization because they have a limited time duration. So examples of projects could include researching new cultivars, providing outreach opportunities on specialty crops to youth, families, seniors, or just your community, or maybe marketing apples through a targeted promotional campaign. So keep in mind you have a distinct goal and it's for a set period of time and it's different than your usual operational activities. Projects use resources that are specifically allocated to the work of that project and usually involve at least one or more people. So activities or tasks that could be a part of the projects I mentioned before could be hiring personnel, purchasing special purpose equipment, holding an educational workshop and purchasing materials for that, such as flyers and preparing demonstrations, or just distributing product promotional materials. This is another key component of the Specialty Crop Block Grant is that it has to benefit the specialty crop industry or the public. It cannot benefit a single entity. Your project has to be for the greater good of the specialty crop industry in the state. It can't just benefit your sole business or your sole organization. The USDA currently encourages projects that benefit smaller farms, new and beginning farmers and ranchers, which are defined as a farm or ranch that is operated for less than 10 years. Underserved producers, which USDA defines as a person or people who are a member of an underserved group. So that is a group that has been subject to discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, age, disability, or where applicable, sex, marital status, familial status, parental status, religion, sexual orientation, genetic information, or political beliefs. And then they also prioritize projects for veteran producers. So that is any producer who has served in the United States Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, or Coast Guard, including the reserve components of those. So for example, an acceptable project would be a farmer implements food safety practices or models on his or her property to meet food safety requirements. And then that farmer conducts a field day and training services to encourage other family farmers in his or her area to adopt those practices. An example of an unacceptable project would be company requests grant funds to purchase like starter plants or equipment used to plant and cultivate those plants just to make a profit or expand their individual business. So just keep in mind that these projects should benefit as many people as possible. We had a question about how much of a percent ownership does the veteran need to own? Just if they are, I would, they don't really define the percentage of ownership on where they give preference. And we don't really assign any points based off of it or anything. It's just that's something that the USDA is currently prioritizing. So if they're at any part in any part of the ownership of the organization who's applying, then that would be a area that the review committee would prioritize. So you don't have to prove it. You don't have to submit any documentation if you fall into any of these categories. Just mention it because that will help elevate your application up. Okay, now to get to like the real nitty gritty, right? People want to know how much they can apply for. So project cost. Kansas's available grant allocation for fiscal year 25 is estimated to be around $330,000. Each year we get a little bit more. The formula that the USDA uses is based off of specialty crop acres planted and specialty crop sales. So every year that Kansas is increasing its specialty crop production and sales in the state, we get a little bit more of that funding percentage. So we're guessing that it'll be a little over $330,000, but that's the estimate we're putting right now without seeing the actual amount. So new this year, applicants can apply for up to $100,000 for their projects. In the past, we have capped that at $75,000, but we know that prices are increasing, so we have changed that to be $100,000 this year. Typically, projects are about, I would say, in the $50,000 to $75,000 range, just based off of project expenses and what people envision they're doing. But we did want to raise that just in case anyone had a really great idea that was going to cost a little bit more money. Typically, we fund around 6 projects per funding cycle, so that kind of tells you we will have some smaller projects and some larger projects to get 6 out of $330,000. For this grant program, matching funds are not required, so you do not have to have a match. So that means you do not have to contribute any of your organization's own funding to the project in order to receive it. And you can also request indirect costs for this grant. So applicants can request up to 8% of their project's total direct costs as indirect costs. So indirect costs are kind of incidental costs that are not specifically listed as budget categories. So maybe you have an accountant who helps you with your record keeping for this grant and you want to have funds to pay them, but don't want to list them as personnel because they're not key to the actual success of the project. Maybe you have just general office related expenses that aren't specific to the project that you want, that you're going to use some of your business's operational costs to do the grant. You can claim those as indirect costs within that 8%. Right. We had a question about, can you ask for planting equipment if it is to educate people on different planting processes from line crops? Special purpose equipment is very tricky with this grant. I would say it's very hard to get approved to purchase equipment from the USDA's perspective. Special purpose equipment is defined as equipment over $5,000 for a single purchase, and it has to be used for specifically for the grant project. So if you have any chance of also using that planting equipment on your own operation after the grant's over, I would say that's not eligible for this grant program because it has to benefit more than just your operation, and that specific piece of equipment would have a greater benefit for you than it would the specialty crop industry as a whole. So you're welcome to do a project about educating people on different planting processes, but you most likely would already need to have that planting equipment in your possession. If you do have specific questions, like maybe it's like a very technical piece of equipment that's new and it's not standard for the industry and it's very unique and you want to showcase that often in educational programming, just send me a message after this meeting or as you're working on your application, and I can always run it by the USDA And that goes for anyone. If you have project questions that you're not sure if something is eligible or not, I'd rather you send me an email or give me a call up front before you invest all your time and energy on filling out all the application steps uh, to only find out it's not eligible later on. So I'm always here to run ideas by, and I can always send it to my grant specialist for further clarification if I don't know the answer. All right. So grants are not free money. I think most people understand that at this point in time, but grants come with reporting requirements. So this grant is a reimbursement grant, which means that you have to spend the funds up front and then we pay you back for those expenses. We reimburse on a quarterly basis. So once a quarter, you'll turn in your expenses related to your project. You'll turn in receipts showing that you paid for those things that you purchased with the grant, and then we will pay you back. So we always try to be very upfront with that, knowing that you have to put up the expenses up front, then we will pay you back for them. Recipients are required to report project progress and expenditures on a quarterly basis. So that means, like I talked about, you'll do your invoice, but you'll also be required to do a narrative report that just talks about any challenges or you've experienced, what developments you've made on your project, if you've had any results yet, if you have any pictures, or maybe you made a flyer, like a promotional materials, you can attach those so we can see them, those types of things. If you do social media as part of the grant, you could send us some examples of your social media posts that you did that quarter. We just basically want to check in on a quarterly basis to make sure that your project is progressing, uh, identify any areas where we can help you if you're struggling, and just make sure you're on track to have a successful project. You're also required to complete reports at the end of your project and then once a year if your project is more than 1 year in duration. So, for example, if you have a 2 year project, you'd be required to report at the end of the first year, and then at the end of the second year, you would turn in your final report. So, the annual and final reports are what go to the USDA. They don't see any of your quarterly reports. That's just the Kansas Department of Agriculture's record keeping. The annual and final reports go to the USDA. So, those ones are a little bit longer usually, but we try to set you up for success with the quarterly reports by asking you very similar prompts so that when you go to fill out your annual and final reports, you've already been accumulating all of that information in your quarterly reports and you can just sum it up in your annual and final report. Right. Those are the reporting requirements. So let's talk a little bit about the application process. I mentioned that we will have a specific presentation in 2 weeks to go step by step through the application process, but I wanted to give you just a very broad overview of what that looks like. So new this year, the entire process is now through a grant management system. It's online called eCivis, and this is a program used by the state of Kansas across different cabinet branches, and this is the first time that the Department of Agriculture has got to take advantage of it, which I think is going to be very helpful for applicants because in the past we've had issues with files not opening, formatting being off, those type of things. And eCivis will standardize the whole process. So everyone can utilize that online portal. You can save it as you go. You don't have to do it all in one sitting. And I think that hopefully the prompts will be pretty straightforward to make it clear. So let me go ahead and share what the eCivis webpage looks like if you haven't opened it yet. Yeah. So this is what the landing page looks like. If you go to our website or you got the press release and it directed you back to KDA's website, when you click on the complete online application link, it will take you to this eCivis landing page for the Specialty Crop Block Grant Program. So the first page just gives like a general overview of what the program's purpose is, the application start date and end date. Applications are due Monday, March 31st at 5 p.m. I like to stress that 5 p.m., not midnight. A lot of people who are used to assignments think that they have until 11:59 p.m. on a day. This stops at 5 because I want to be here to help you if you have running into any issues. So I want to close it at 5 because I will still be working up until that point and can help you if you have any problems. There's a couple different tabs here. There's an eligibility tab that talks about what types of organizations are eligible to apply. As we mentioned, um, pretty much as long as you are not um, trying to benefit your single organization, you are good to go. Private sector can apply, schools, local government, academic institutions, nonprofits. Pretty much everyone is eligible. The financial tab talks about the maximum award being $100,000 and about how much funding we'll have available. The contact is going to give you all my contact information, but there's also a support email here. If you have any problems specifically with the eCivis system, you can email that email address. If you have any questions regarding the content of the application, I would be happy to help you. And there's also a files tab. So it has the request for applications document, which I would encourage everyone to read before you start the application. It has an eCivis portal guide. So if you haven't ever used eCivis before, which I'm guessing is the majority of everyone applying this year, it just has some general tips on how to use eCivis. There's a quick start guide to getting a unique entity ID, which stands for UEI. All applicants must have a UEI in order to receive federal funds. So if you've never applied for a grant that comes from the federal government, I would suggest starting the UEI process now because it can take a couple of weeks to generate that number through the system, depending on how many people are applying for grants at a time. So if you don't have a unique entity ID through the federal government, there is a quick start guide on the Kansas Department of Agriculture's website. It's through a website called sam.gov, and we've got a little guide that tells you how to answer the different prompts. And there's also a frequently asked questions document. So this is also on the Specialty Crop Block Grant webpage on our website. If you scroll down to application resources, a lot of these things are down here. Anything you might need for filling out the application can be found under application resources. I always say, when in doubt, read the request for applications document or give me a call or send me an email and I'd be happy to answer your questions. Okay. So I like to give everyone an understanding of what the review process looks like. So after you submit your application and the deadline has passed, we will start the review process. So there are several stages, which is why it takes so long to receive funding notification. So the first step is KDA is going to do an internal eligibility review just to make sure your project is eligible for funding. At that time, we will look through it and write down revision suggestions on how to make your project stronger and increase the likelihood that it will be approved by the USDA. We will also at that same time send all eligible applications to an external review committee to be scored. And once those scores come back, we will look at how much funding we have and where the scores fell. And we will present a funding proposal to our Secretary of Agriculture, Mike Beam. He and his executive team will review those top projects that we propose to fund based off of scoring and our funding allocation. And then I will reach out to those projects that are considered for funding and request revisions on their projects. That is just to make sure that you have the strongest application possible to go forward to the USDA. At that time, we'll submit our state plan proposal to the USDA for their review. Most likely, even as thorough as I try to be, they're going to come back with their own set of revisions on your projects. And so they'll do their round of revisions, we'll send it back to them, and then we'll get final approval, which is usually about mid to late August once it's all said and done. So it's a long process between March 31st and the middle of August on knowing whether funding is coming your way or not. So just be patient. Revisions come fast some years, slow some years. Sometimes your project might not need revisions, sometimes you do. So just be patient with us and know that funding you'll know for sure by the end of August if you're going to be funded to start at the end of September, early October on your project. All right. So at this point, I just want to invite everyone to join me on Wednesday, March 5th at 1 o'clock. That is when we're going to do the application walkthrough, and it'll have plenty of time for questions. We're going to go step by step through the application, and I'm going to tell you what we're looking for in every little form field on there. So I really enjoy supporting people through the application process. I'm not available to help write, but I can give you words of encouragement, give you ideas and clarification on what each form field is looking for. So join me on March 5th. This presentation today was recorded, so you can go back and watch it at any point in time if you have questions about what we talked about here today. The application walkthrough will also be recorded, and it's always my goal to get them up on the website in the same place where you found this link within 24 to 48 hours. So by the end of the week, this one will be up. And then by the end of the week, in 2 weeks, the application walkthrough will be up. So don't worry about if you can't be there live. That's totally fine. You can ask questions afterwards, and you can always go back and reference it. So maybe you're working on your application on a Saturday morning and you're like, what did Brittany say about the project purpose? You can go back and find it on the recording. At this point, I am going to stop the recording. And you guys are welcome to come off mute and ask questions. You can throw them in the chat. I'm just going to stop the recording at